Well, today, as I said already, is All Saints Sunday, the one day in the church year set aside specifically for remembering those who have gone to heaven ahead of us. There's something comforting as a believer to take one day each year to remember specifically and deliberately that even though our loved one has died, that one day there will be a reunion in heaven. And that's something that can bring comfort to any believer on any day of the year, but it is important to have one day set aside specifically to remind us of that truth, of the resurrection that will occur for all believers. But this day is about more than simply remembering our loved ones who have died. It's also about acknowledging the reality of death. I think that is an important differentiation to make, because when you lose a loved one, it's not really something that you get over. It's just something that you learn to live with. And each of us, even those of us who have never lost a loved one, it's important for us to acknowledge that death is a reality. Death is a part of life, and we can't experience the glory of heaven without first experiencing our earthly deaths. As Jesus says in John chapter 12, he said, "Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Without the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, death would be an eternal ending. But because of Jesus Christ, the power of death has been destroyed. Death is no longer an ending, but merely a transition to a better place. But even knowing all of that, because I know all that, I believe all of that, but even knowing all of that, for me personally, I still can't get past the fact that death makes me angry. I suppose that's my humanness, my brokenness, my sinfulness that does not want to embrace the beauty and blessing that death can be. Death has always been something that makes me angry. When I see people grieving, it bothers me, and I wish it weren't so. And in a way, I like to think I'm in good company feeling that way. See, when Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus died, well, he was ill, and they called to him, to Jesus, to come and heal him. But Jesus didn't go immediately. He knew Lazarus would die, and yet he waited 3 days before going to him. In fact, he waited specifically so Lazarus would die. Now, that might sound crazy, very unlike Jesus, waiting in order that someone would die. But that's what he did, because he wanted to show the people the greatest of all miracles in his own perfect time. And so he waited to go to Lazarus until Lazarus was already dead, so that Jesus could raise him from the dead in the midst of all the people. And listen to what happens in the story from John chapter 11. You know the story. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been in there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped with strips of linen and his cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." It tells us in the story that when Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who were with her weeping, Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It tells us that on account of their grief, Jesus wept. It tells us that when they arrived at the tomb, Jesus again was deeply moved. And yet it wasn't because Lazarus had died that caused his grief, because he knew he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead. That was his plan. His grief then was caused by seeing the suffering of those who loved Lazarus. Because you see, Jesus hates death too. He does. If it wasn't for that fact, he wouldn't have died on the cross to save us from eternal death. There is but one singular reason that he died on the cross, and that is to save us from eternal death. And even though Jesus has destroyed the power of death and has provided a way for us to be saved from eternal death, he still sees that death brings us great sorrow. And for that reason, Jesus hates death still. And I'm so glad to know that Jesus wept at the thought of Mary and Martha's breaking hearts. Because then I'm reassured that Jesus weeps when any of us might suffer from a breaking heart. At the time of a funeral, then, we know that Jesus is not only holding that loved one who has died in his arms, but he's also sitting in the pews with the people who are still alive, who are suffering in their souls. Jesus sits next to the family members and weeps as they weep. Not because death is an ending, because Jesus knows that it's not, but he weeps on account of their weeping hearts, of those left behind. The other day, I heard the story of a man whose son died in the year 2009. His son's name was Connor, and he died of complications from pneumonia. Prior to coming down with pneumonia, he had been a perfectly healthy 12-year-old boy. But because of complications, his life was suddenly taken from him, and he was taken from his family. And as part of this story, this is what Connor's father had to say about his own grieving experience. He said, "I know in my life, my whole world is different now. And sometimes I feel like I'm walking around and I'm in a bubble. And everyone's living their life and moving fast around me, and I'm just kind of living in my own little world, disconnected from where everybody else is at. When people enter my world and let me talk about Connor and let me share that and my journey and give voice to his life, that brings honor to him and it makes me feel good." Maybe you can empathize with Connor's dad. Maybe you can grasp the depth of his grief because you have experienced grief deeply in your own life. Maybe you have felt, or maybe still feel like you're walking around in a bubble and everyone's moving fast around you. That is deep grief, and it's yours to own as your very own. Jesus gives us permission to have that pain in our hearts and to hold it because it's ours. But at the same time, he gives us something really amazing and beautiful, the promise of the words from the Beatitudes, particularly when he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." When we read that passage, especially when we're in the midst of grief, we may wonder how our mourning can be a blessing. Because you know that when you lose someone special, it leaves a hole in your life. And it might seem comforting to think that someday that hole will be filled by something else or someone else, or maybe even by God himself. But the truth is that that hole will always be there. Now, that might sound like a desperate, hopeless statement, but it's actually not. In fact, it's the exact opposite, because it's in that hole that the blessing of mourning is found. Because if there is a hole in your heart, the love of Jesus and the healing that he offers can flow through us. If the hole were healed, the love of Jesus may risk ending at our own hearts, filling us up, but not flowing on to others who need our love and his love. But when Jesus' love and peace flow through that hole, his love can be passed on to others who also need that. And not only that, but they will have received something special simply by the fact that his love has flowed through your pain. You can bring a special touch of comfort. And each time Jesus' love flows through that hole, he heals it a little more. Never stopping up the hole, but smoothing its edges like water can smooth a stone. And so we hear this morning on this All Saints Sunday these comforting words from the book of Revelation. "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more.' Amen."